You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to join you again, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. For our listeners, I should outline that today on the podcast, we're going to be revisiting Southeast Asia. As you know, we like to jump around Asia a little bit on the show. But this time, Prashant and I are actually going to take this opportunity to review something that we haven't really talked about on the podcast in a while, which is we're going to talk about the state of democracy in Southeast Asia. And specifically, we're going to focus on three cases in this podcast. We're going to focus on Indonesia, where we recently had, at the end of June, we had major local elections, and that country is coming up on a major general election next year for the next president. So we can talk a bit about where things are going in Indonesia. Second, we'll talk about Cambodia. As listeners might know, Cambodia has been sort of a major hotspot of democratic regression and authoritarian upsurge in Southeast Asia under Prime Minister Hun Sen. And then we'll close out the podcast with a discussion of the current state of Thailand, where a military junta continues to be in power with elections supposedly around the corner, but remains to be seen if those will happen. So we'll be taking stock of effectively democracy around Southeast Asia today. So Prashant, I want to start with Indonesia. So 2018 is a big year for electoral politics in the country. The elections that we just had, we saw 171 different provincial elections around the country. Voters selected a range of local leaders, including governors and mayors around the country. And I wanted to sort of get your sense of what really we saw as a result of this election. We have talked about Indonesian democracy on the podcast fairly recently in the context of the changing nature of political Islam in Indonesia and how that might threaten the ruling PDIP and the odds for that party going into the general elections. So what did you see in the recent provincial elections in Indonesia, and what did they tell you about where democracy in the country is headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, as you correctly highlighted, the reason why these regional elections are getting so much attention is that it plays into the bigger question of whether we're going to get a few more years of continuity under the government of Joko Widodo, which is under the PDIP, or whether we're going to be in for a change that could see more sort of the emergence of a more perhaps radical, nationalistic, and maybe some changes in foreign policy too in terms of where Indonesia is headed. And if you're looking for indicators with respect to that, what you're looking for is clues about the role of religion in politics, which has been a huge issue in Indonesia. Jokowi's own popularity, what candidates did the PDIP back, and did those candidates win? And what does it say about the rise of potential future leaders? And in all those cases, I think you would say the PDIP suffered some significant setbacks in the
Mm-hmm.
regional elections, and the opposition coalition, which is a range of parties, did have a range of victories in some of these elections. And I think the second thing that came out clearly was that there was some evidence of Islamist grassroots mobilization, not to a significant degree, but there was some of it. And I think some folks are seeing that as a staging ground or kind of a preparatory round for the presidential elections next year. And that worries some folks who think that there might be some mobilization. We talked about the Ahok case and the Jakarta governor race, for example. So that's something which is going to play into calculations in the presidential elections next year.
Right, right. And so, one of the long-standing trends in Indonesian politics in the democratization era is the phenomenon of former military officials, generals running in elections. So Jokowi was previously challenged by Prabowo, and now I think we're starting to see signs that members of the former military are starting to collaborate with these ascendant political Islamist forces in the country. Do you see that becoming a major thing for us to watch going into 2019?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the big worries. We saw that case with Prabowo. We've seen cases with former and even at that time current Indonesian military officials, forming alliances or at least suggesting that they would be open to such alliances. So that is a concern. The reason why that is a concern is because I think, at least some observers view this as a symptom of a wider problem, which is the emergence of an Indonesia that's perhaps, more less tolerant, but also perhaps more nationalistic on the world stage. So one thing that we can say about the Jokowi administration is that it's been active internationally. I mean, we've written about developments in Indonesia. We wrote about, for example, you wrote this week about the Sabang port and involvement with India, for example.
Hmm.
We've talked about U.S.-Indonesia relations before, so they've been active, but there's been a lot more domestic focus in terms of the prioritization, right? So
Right.
if it affects Indonesia's domestic politics, Jokowi's more willing to invest in that. So what does that mean for a leader like Prabowo or somebody else of that orientation? How might Indonesia's foreign policy change? And that, I think, is what some people are looking to in 2019.
So let me ask you that then. I mean, this is a geopolitics podcast, so I think we can help our listeners maybe prepare for the possibility that Indonesia does see a significant change in next year's 2019 elections. What are some of the outcomes that we might expect?
No, absolutely. I think that's the big question. So I think if you look at this idea of a more nationalistic Indonesia, a more assertive Indonesia, a more confident Indonesia, the first place you'd see that in terms of assertiveness is Indonesia's surrounding waters and potentially disputes that it has with neighboring countries. So Indonesia has a number of
Hmm.
disputes. There's outstanding disputes with Malaysia, but there's also Indonesia is not officially a claimant in the South China Sea disputes, but there are disputes that it has with China as well with respect to the Natunas. And the Jokowi administration has been nationalistic as well with respect to those. But could we see a new administration that would be more assertive and perhaps more, I guess, I don't want to say militaristic, but I guess more forward-leaning and perhaps a little bit more discerning in terms of how it addresses these issues, and that could potentially create problems on the China side.
Hmm.
But similarly with the United States too. I mean, if you see the emergence of a less tolerant Indonesia and an Indonesia that's more assertive, that historically is tracked with administrations that also have problems with the United States. The idea that
Right.
the United States is trying to restrict Indonesia's autonomy. So this could play both ways in terms of relations with the United States, China, and also neighboring states.
Right. It could also be very interesting within ASEAN, where Indonesia is the big heavyweight. If you have an Indonesia that treats its role within ASEAN significantly differently, I can see that having important implications for the region as well, especially if we also see tensions grow with China.
Absolutely.
Hmm. All right. Well, I think that's something to watch. Certainly, I think Indonesia's got an interesting year coming up ahead, and I think the recent local elections really give us a good launch pad into the general elections next year. But how about we talk a bit about Cambodia?
Sure.
So Cambodia, unfortunately, has been the real sore point in Southeast Asia in terms of regression along several axes: human rights, democracy, rule of law. Hun Sen has led the country for more than 30 years, but in 2017 we saw a serious crackdown, the arrest of opposition leaders, and all sorts of regressions there. And
Mhm.
I really don't see any signs of short-term improvement in Cambodia. The country continues to be pulled into China's sort of orbit, and it finds a willing partner in Beijing that's not going to give it any grief. In the meantime, we have a U.S. administration that's quite disinterested in the issues of human rights, rule of law, and democratization in Southeast Asia. So really, it seems like Hun Sen is in quite a powerful position right now. But looks can be deceiving. Cambodia could be heading into a period of sustained destabilization. But what's your assessment of what's going on there? Obviously, we do have the local elections there coming up later this month as well. So it'll be interesting to hear your take on that, Prashant.
No, absolutely. I think that's the right way to frame it, which is that, in the Indonesia case, we have just a full range of outcomes and folks are trying to discern what scenarios are more likely. In the Cambodia case, it's almost like, because the outcome is so assured, the conversation's already shifted to what's Cambodia's post-election future and climate going to look like, right? Whether it is going to be the continuation of what we've seen over the past year, which is a pattern of domestic consolidation and opposition crackdown, a period where Cambodia, which is historically known for trying its best to diversify its relationships, has gotten closer to China. And also relationships with Western countries, including the United States, have been strained. So is that going to be the scenario that we see if, unless there's going to be a major sort of unprecedented development and the CPP and Hun Sen get voted out of power, or could, as you hinted, could looks be deceiving and we see a period where Cambodia and Hun Sen, having consolidated domestically and having won the election, then pivot to this idea of now that we've got this stability, let's now talk to Western countries, including the United States, and try to at least return back to this period of diversification because we don't want to grow too dependent on China? And will we see potentially domestically as well the CPP bringing in young people into its leadership and potentially Hun Sen slowly laying the groundwork for succession, whether it's to his children or potential allies? That's another thing I think that would be interesting to see because that would have big implications for Cambodia's foreign policy and geopolitics that we've talked about in the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think the
Yeah.
succession issue in Cambodia doesn't get enough play. It's quite significant. But, these upcoming local communal elections in Cambodia, I think there's also, serious concerns that they just simply won't be free and fair in any real way. So, I think the expectation is that, Hun Sen and the CPP end up coming out quite well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you pointed out with the introduction for Cambodia, I mean, given the fact that the Cambodia's biggest opposition party has been dissolved and the leaders are one leader's behind bars, another one is in exile, it really is the case that the CPP will probably and most likelihood preserve its leadership. The issue is, and I think this is kind of the sort of black swan event here. I mean, could we see protests and potential
Hmm.
destabilization in Cambodia following the elections?
Right.
And the other part of that's been really interesting that we've been tracking too, right, is what is the role of outside powers as we see this period of crackdown in Cambodia? I mean, we've seen the Western powers threatening Cambodia with sanctions and sort of maintaining arm's length. But we also have seen an interesting dynamic where China, but also Japan, have funded and become really involved with the upcoming elections. And in China's case, we've seen, recent reports about interference in Cambodia's election and a Chinese hacking group conducting phishing attacks. So this Cambodian election has been remarkable not just for its domestic implications, but also the role of outside powers and how they're trying to sort of navigate this domestic political environment, which has been really interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's another election to watch and another country to keep a close eye on.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, like I said, I'm not too optimistic for improvements in Cambodia, but I think there are a lot of sort of unexpected pathways for things to really change in that country too.
Mhm.
Um, all right, so moving on to Thailand. I believe since the coup in 2014, we've had sort of 6 different promises from Prime Minister Prayut, the former general, about elections in the country. And the current date that we're anticipating elections is early spring 2019, around February. They were supposed to happen in November 2018. That was the 5th promised date. That's not going to happen, it looks like. But yeah, I mean, this is where we are with Thailand. We've been anticipating these elections coming up. The country's constitution has been changed, which we discussed on a podcast recently too. But yeah, Prashant, looking at Thailand, what's your sense of the prognosis for democracy there?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you put it. I mean, the fact that you've had these series of promises that are not fulfilled really has gotten the Thai public really sort of skeptical about whether they will happen at all or whether they'll happen on time. So, in fact, if you look at the polling, a majority of Thais don't believe that an election will happen in 2019. There's still a significant number that believe it will, but the fact that you're seeing a majority of public opinions shift like that significantly is really telling. I think the other dynamic here that's really interesting is that the question really, in terms of the debate, has shifted from, when the election will be held to, if an election really will matter at all, right?
Hmm.
So the junta has moved to ensure that the election process and outcome will be designed to almost guarantee its continued strong role,
Right.
and that the pro-Thaksin forces won't emerge in terms of a position of primacy in Thai politics. So
Do
the
you want to just
question
quickly tell
is,
our listeners who, when you refer to pro-toxin forces, who you're talking about in Thailand, just to
right?
give some context?
Right, right. So the former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who was ousted in a previous coup, and sort of saw following that, still remains pretty active in Thai politics, and there's been the succession of pro-Thaksin forces and parties that have merged and positioned against the monarchy and the ruling military. So that's kind of the struggle in Thai politics. I do think that, since we are in the geopolitics podcast, where this is interesting for foreign policy is what does this say about Thai foreign policy when you have this, sort of protracted period of political uncertainty, right? It makes it really difficult to forecast strategically where Thailand will be on its foreign alignments, first of all. And then secondly, as you pointed out with respect to Cambodia, you're seeing this dynamic where when countries are, surprise, surprise, right? When they're involved domestically with their internal affairs, what they want to do is to cultivate relationships with partners who A, can bring quick economic wins for them, and B, will be more forgiving of them if they have to do undemocratic political things. And that means more China for Thailand and sometimes less the United States. Now, under the Trump administration, we've actually seen the Trump administration move closer to Thailand and actually secure a lot of political and security cooperation, in part because, as you noted, there's less of a concern for democracy and human rights relative to the Obama administration.
Right.
But it still is the case that Thailand is quite close to China, and a lot of the cooperation that is undergoing now, if you were to ask really anyone who observes the region, 10 years ago, be very surprised to think that, Thailand is moving forward with buying submarines from China.
That's right. That's all. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big question here as well. And I think that's kind of the big story with a lot of this democratic regression in Southeast Asia is that it is an immense opportunity for China. I think the pathways are different, right? We shouldn't paint all of these very diverse
Right.
countries with one broad brush, saying that troubling democratic forces in ascendant political Islam in Indonesia is one thing, and the Thai junta is another thing. But I think the prospects for China, the opportunities that lie ahead for China in Southeast Asia, I think are very much interlinked with these domestic forces. And I don't think we have time today, but I think maybe another day we should go back and also revisit the aftermath of the recent Malaysian election, which has been obviously very interesting to observe there, and how that country's reevaluating its relationship with China, and especially the former economic projects in the context of corruption. So, Southeast Asia remains complex, but I do think that on balance, a lot of this does present quite an opportunity for China.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Prashant, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Great. For our listeners, thanks as always for listening. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please do so. You can do so on iTunes or Google Play and a range of other podcast hosts. And if you've been a subscriber but you haven't left us a review on those services yet, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.